Hi class. So in the first three chapters, you should have gotten a good review over kind of the basics of computers, things like machine language, how things are compiled, high-level languages like C++ are compiled into machine language, and just kind of basic overview of computers, how they work. And then you should have started looking into chapter 2 and chapter 3, which is on inputs, outputs, some of the fundamentals of C++ and programming in general. And then getting into classes. So for this example, I want to kind of go through, kind of explain these concepts through code, and just kind of give you an example of everything working, and so you can see it in action. So what I want to do is create an account class. So I want an example of, basically we want to create an application where you can store an account, and the account will contain the person's name attached to the account and the balance. Okay, so it's going to be simple. Just kind of show the idea and the concepts. Okay, so remember there, for every C++ application, we want to have our main CPP file. So again, for the assignment for the lab 1, this is not asked for to have this to actually name your main file main, but typically you want to name your main file that contains the main function. You want to name it main. So we're going to do that in this example. So in this example, we're going to create this new main CPP file. So we can say right click, add new item. We're going to add this main CPP file. Okay, so here it is. So what we want to do is initially just create the basics that we need for this main CPP. So we always want to include the IO stream. So we're going to include IO stream. So it should use these this pound include in the brackets IO stream, and then we want to include string. So this allows us to use the string object, and finally we want to use the namespace std. So we want to say using namespace std. Okay. So remember, we want to create an account object that's going to contain the name and the balance of the account, right? The name on the account and the balance of the account. So in order to do that, we're going to create an account class. Okay, so to do that, we're going to right click, add new item, and we're going to create the header file. We're going to call it account. Okay, so you should have learned in previous classes the idea of separating your header file from the CPP file, or in other words, separating the prototypes of a class, the function prototypes, from the actual function definitions, right? So you're kind of separating the public interface from the actual definitions of the function, the functions of the class. Okay, so you're separating the class's interface from the functions of the class, how the functions are actually defined. Okay, so here in the header file, we're just going to have the actual function prototypes, right? We're going to describe the class in this header file. So in order to do that, let's first include the IO stream, and we're going to include string, and again we're going to using namespace std. Okay, so another key piece here is that, so there's another piece that for header files that you want to make sure you include. This is this pound if and def and the name of the class in capital underscore H and define. And then you have to end if. So the purpose of this, this if and diff, which stands for if not defined, the purpose is to actually, it's a guard. So it's an include guard that prevents the code between this if and diff, indef, and the end if. The code prevents the code in between these statements from being included if this class already exists. Right, so it's basically just a guard, a protection. Okay, so you should definitely include it with all of your header files. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say public. Class account, and be sure that at the end of the class you always have you're going to use the curly brackets, and at the end of the curly brackets you're going to have the semicolon. So inside you're going to have your public and your private member functions and variables. So first let's actually set the member variables. So what we're going to do is say private. So we're going to have a name and a balance, right? So we're going to need a string for the name and an int. We're going to use an int for balance. So one thing we're going to do is make sure we comment this. So we're going to say this is name of person holding the account, and this will be the balance on the account. Okay, so we set our private variables, and remember, the reason why we set them private is for this idea of encapsulation. So encapsulation is the idea that we want to keep these variables private and local to the class itself, so that no other methods or other files, other classes, other functions that are outside of this class can actually modify these variables, right? So you want to make sure that private and local to the class itself. And this is the idea of encapsulation, and we'll show how we can actually access them using these accessor and mutator methods, get and set methods, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the next thing we want to do is actually create we'll create the actual methods for the class. So the first thing we want to do is say they're going to be public, so these methods can be accessed by outside of the class. So remember, we're just creating the prototype, so we're not actually going to define the functions. We're just going to have the interface for these functions. So we're going to just describe them here. So first thing we need are the constructors. So we'll say constructors. So remember, the constructor is what is called when you actually create an instance of this the class. So when you actually create an object account, an account object, which we'll do in the main function, you're going to actually it's going to actually call a constructor, whether it's the default constructor or an overloaded constructor with parameters. So let's actually create the default constructor. Okay, so notice that for the default constructor, it's just the name of the class. These have to match, and then with no inputs. Okay, so we'll just call this default constructor. Okay, and then we want to have a constructor where you can actually pass in arguments. Okay, so it takes in parameters. So we'll have account, and we'll have a string, right, for the name, and an int. Okay, and we're going to say this is overload constructor. So we're going to overload the constructor. Basically, by overloading, we're using the same name but different parameters, right? So now we can pass in a string and an int for the name and the balance, and the name of the constructor still has to be the same. But now when you actually want to create an object, an account object, you can pass in these parameters as well. Okay, so you have the default constructor and an overload constructor. Okay, so the next thing we want to do, let's go ahead and create the actual CPP file for account that will actually have the function definitions. So to do that, we're going to go over here to source files. We're going to add new item. We're going to add a CPP file, and we're going to name it the same name as the class, account. So this is going to actually implement those functions that we are initializing here, right? We're declaring here. So we declare the functions here, and we're going to actually define them and implement them in the CPP file. So I'm going to put that here. Okay, so in the CPP file, the only thing that we actually need to include is the name of the header file that is actually defining. So say account.h. Okay, so we actually don't need to include the IL stream or string. Oh, sorry about that. We don't actually need to include the IO string, IO stream, and sorry about that, in string, because that's actually going to be included inside of the .h. So when we include the .h file here, it's actually also including this IO stream and string as well. Okay, so we only need to include this. Okay, and then the next thing we want to actually do is implement, right, or define the functions that we declared in the account.h. So we declared these two account constructors. So let's actually define them here. And to do that, we have to first specify the class that we're of the function that we're defining. So we can say account and these two colons. And now you can see the options that we have, and we want to actually define the default constructor. Okay, and inside this constructor, all we're going to do is initialize the balance to 0. Okay, so it knows that we're working, that we're implementing or defining the this account constructor inside the account class, and so it knows that this balance variable exists as a private variable inside this account class, right? So it's here. Notice that we didn't have to actually initialize the string. We didn't have to do this because C++ by default, when you declare a string, the string class is going to actually initialize it to an empty string. Okay, so we don't need to actually initialize strings. Just need to initialize these numeric values, numeric types. Okay, so we did that. So we're going to just say implement default constructor. Okay, so let's also, or let's say defines default constructor, and we'll say defines overload constructor. Okay, so we're going to define this, and we're going to say account. So remember, now it's actually going to pass, you're going to pass in variables. So we're going to say string, a new name, and int new balance. So these variables are going to be local to this this function, right? This constructor function. And what we're going to do is simply just say name, right? The name of the private variable of the account class, right, is going to be equal to new name. And same with balance. Balance is equal to new balance. Okay, so let's go back to our main.cpp. So here, let's actually create the main function. So remember, it's int main, no parameters, and we want to return 0. And let's also add our system pause. Okay, so what we want to do is let's actually just create an account object. So we can say account, and we'll just call it account1. And maybe we'll pass in John and a balance of $1,000. Okay, so there's one key thing we're missing here, right? So you notice it's not defined. We have to make sure that we include account.h, include count.h inside of the main file as well. Okay, so what we did here was actually create an account object called account1 using this account class, and we're using the overloaded constructor by passing in a name, John, and the integer value for the balance, 1,000, which represents the $1,000, right? And we can do this because we created this overloaded constructor here that takes in a string and int, and we defined it here. Okay, so let's continue. So say we actually wanted to access or modify these values. So of the account1 object. Okay, so to actually remove, modify or access, be able to access these variables, we have to set get and set functions for each of the variables. So let's actually do that. So if we go to our header file, let's create these functions. So one other thing we should do here is also specify that there are parameters. So we can say @param string new name of attached to account, and int new balance for account. Okay, so let's actually create the mutator and accessor functions. So let's start with the mutator functions. So remember, the mutator functions are those functions that allow us to set the variables of the object or class. So what we can do is we can say void, and we'll do the name first, set name, and we're going to pass in a string. So we're going to say string new name. I'm sorry, string. We'll actually define these variables in the CPP file. So we're going to pass in a string, and we're going to actually define it also in the CPP file. So you can define functions inside the header file, which you'll be doing for the first lab, just because this is just sort of getting back in the hang of things and trying to just implement functions and define functions. But typically you want to actually define the function inside the CPP file and only just declare the function or prototype here in the header file. So okay, we're going to create this, and we're going to create a comment for it. We're going to say sets the name of a person holding account, and has param string okay. So we're going to do the same thing for the balance. So we're going to say set balance int, right? So the balance is an int. So remember, these are the parameters that are being passed in. These are the types of data that are being passed in. So for the name it's a string, for the balance we're doing an integer, and we can end it there. And same thing, let's add our comments. Sets the balance of the account, and it has an int and new balance of account. Okay, and we'll put new just to be clear. So now we have our two mutator methods. So let's actually implement them or define them inside the account. So remember, here's where we actually will define those methods. So we have to make sure we name them the same and specify that they're attached to the account class. So we can define set function for name. So we'll say account set name, and now we can actually say new name, right? So this is the local variable which will be passed in, and it'll be actually set to the name of the actual in the actual class. So we'll do that here. Oh, had too many C's. And then we can say name equals new name. So it's that simple. So we're setting the name of the actual account class variable, right? This name here. We're setting it to the new name that's being passed in. Okay. And then make sure. Okay. So let's actually do the same for the balance. So set function for balance. So count set balance int new balance, and we're going to set the balance equal to this new balance that's being passed in. Okay, so you might notice that there's an error here, and this is because we also always have to specify the type, the return type, as well in the definition, right, in the CPP file. So we're going to say void, okay? Otherwise, it's going to assume it's an int, and that's not correct. All right, so we save that, and there you go. The error goes away, okay? So the next thing we want to do is actually, so we have our set, our accessor functions, our set functions. So now we want to actually create our get functions. Set functions are our mutator functions, and the get functions are our accessor functions. So we want to actually create the get functions, the accessor functions. Okay, so let's actually go to the header file, and here we're going to create the get function. So remember, our get functions are going to return a value. They're going to return the name and the balance, right? So the name is a string, so our return type for the name get function should be string get name, and it's not going to have any parameters. And one thing you always want to make sure you declare your get functions as this const. This stands for constant, and it's used because you're not modifying anything inside of the function. So these are used when nothing is being modified. When you're not modifying the variables, use const. It's not required, but it's highly recommended. It's very good coding, C++ coding practice. So I highly recommend that whenever you're declaring a function that's not modifying any variables, use const. Okay. We're gonna have no brackets because we're in our header file. So we're just declaring the function, and that's it. Okay. So then we can just have comments for this. Get the name of account holder. And return string name of account holder. There's different ways you can do this, your comments, but just make sure you do comment each function. So then we also want to do one for our balance. So we're returning an integer this time, so we do int get balance const gets the balance of account, and it returns int, don't forget your 2 lines for your comments, 2 forward slashes, and we have balance of account. Okay, so now we have our 2 accessor functions. So now we actually have to define them, right? We have to implement them. So we do that here in our CPP file, and we're going to say define get function for name. So we're no longer going to use void, right? Because now we're actually returning a string. We're returning the name. So we can say string account get name, and notice it comes up. You can autocomplete by pressing tab. And remember, we have to still be consistent. We have to include const because we did that in the header file. Okay, and then we're just going to return name. And we're going to do the same thing for the balance. Define get function for balance, and we're going to return an int this time. And we're going to say get balance and const and return balance. Okay, so that's done. So apologize for that. And so we're going to, so now we have our set and get method functions. Okay, so we go to our header. Everything is good here. You can notice those 2 warnings go away. And let's just create one more function. Let's create a function that will actually withdraw money from the account. So we given an input amount of withdrawal amount. You can then subtract that from the balance and then update the balance. Okay, so we're going to do that. We're going to create a header, create a function declaration first for that. So it's not going to return anything. It's just going to update the balance of the object. So we're going to say void. We'll just call it withdraw. And you're going to pass in an integer, right? So this is the withdrawal amount. We're going to call this withdrawal amount. And then, sorry, we're not going to implement it here because we are in the header. And then we're going to just say this, we'll say withdraws amount given from balance amount. Okay, and it's going to have parameters, param int withdrawal amount. Okay, great. So now we actually have to define this or implement it in the account class or account CPP file. So here we're going to say define withdrawal function. And what we're going to do is actually be consistent, void account withdrawal. And we have an input, right, is going to be an integer, so int withdrawal amount. And I apologize for that. And I apologize, so here we don't want to actually specify the name, right? We just want to keep it, just specify that it will be an int, okay? So in the CPP files where we actually declare specify the name, and we can implement our function here. Okay, so what we want to do is first we only want to withdraw if they have sufficient funds. So what we can do is we can say balance. We can say int some new balance, right? After you do the withdrawal, you can say equals the balance minus withdrawal, if I can spell, withdrawal amount. Okay? And then what we want to do is we can have if statements, right? So this is where we can use our branching conditional if statements. We can say if the new balance is greater than or equal to 0, okay, then we have our brackets. We'll say, first we'll print out, we'll put an end line, sufficient funds successfully withdrawn. Okay, and another end line. There we go. Okay, so and then what we want to do, apologize for that, we want to actually update the balance. We're going to say balance is now equal to new balance, right? We already computed new balance here, so we don't have to do it again here. We did that when we actually declared the integer variable new balance. So else, if new balance is less than 0, right? It's not greater than equal to 0. So if it's less than 0, so else, we don't want to update the balance, and we're going to notify the user that there are insufficient funds. Balance remained the same. Okay, and another end line. Okay, so that's the implementation or definition of this withdraw function, right? So we're only going to update the balance if there's sufficient funds. So balance minus withdrawal amount is greater than or equal to 0. Okay, if not, we're going to just notify the user that there is insufficient funds. Okay, so in our .h file, we have all the necessary mutator and accessor functions. So let's actually say accessor functions, and we'll call these just custom functions. Okay. All right, so that's it. So now let's actually use, so we've implemented a class, we implemented the account class, we implemented the prototype, declared the functions inside the header file, actually implemented or defined these functions inside the CPP file, right? We named them the same, account. So now we have an account class, right? It's fully completed. And again, the reasons why we want to separate the two as well is because now, if you wanted to publicly release, your class to other people, other programmers or a client or whatever it may be, this is useful because now they have access to see what functions they can actually use without knowing what's going on inside the function. So they just know the inputs, outputs, and also what it's actually doing. And that's all they need to know. They don't need to know how it's actually implemented. So that's why the commenting is also important. Okay, and it's also important for code reusability. So you're defining you're declaring the functions in one place, but you can define them differently depending on where they're implemented, which we'll go into more later. But the idea is that you can use it's good for code reusability. Okay, so it's important to have these header files and to declare your functions and member variables as well in this header file, and then define them, implement them in a CPP file that's named the same as the class, right? So account CPP and account 8.h for the header, and make sure you include this if and def and define and end ifs in your header. Okay, so let's actually go to our main now, and let's start using these functions. So let's get rid of this. This actually a request from the user to enter the name and balance. So let's start with that account 1. So we're going to just say cout enter name for account 1. Okay, and then we're going to say we're not going to do an inline, and we're going to say cin, and we're going to say enter, cin name. So we want to actually declare a string called name and a int called balance. Okay, and we're going to read in the name, and then we're going to cout enter, and maybe on a new line we're going to do this. So we're going to say end line, right? And then we're going to say enter initial balance for account 1, and I'm going to close quotation, and there we go. And then we're going to read in the balance. Okay, so we're just prompting the user to enter in the name for the account holder for account 1, and then the initial balance for account 1. Okay, so now we actually want to create the account object. So we can say account, right, the name of the class, account 1, and we're going to pass in, right, this is the overloaded constructor. We're going to pass in the name and balance. Okay, this has to be string and then int for the name and the balance on the account. And now we have an object called account 1 that contains whose values for the variable name and balance are those that are passed in by the user, right, stored in these local variables. And you can name these anything you want, right? You can name these something different. This is local to the main function. We're just naming it the same as those in the class, but you can name these whatever you want. Once you pass them in, we're passing in the values, right? And that's another key point, is that we're not passing by reference. We're passing values. So you can name these whatever you want. You can pass these in, and these are the values that are going to be passed to this account 1 object. All right. And then let's just print it out. So cout, we're going to say account 1 name, and we're going to say account 1. So notice we can't just say account 1 name, right? If we did this, we get an error. Account 1 name, right? We can't do this because this is trying to directly access the name variable of the account 1 object. But remember, it's private, right? So it's not gonna, when you compile this, it's gonna throw an error. So that's why we have, this is the idea of encapsulation, right? We can't directly access this name variable and tamper with it, and do things that we're not supposed to. So instead, that's why we have these accessor and mutator functions, the get and set functions. So instead, we're gonna use the get name function. Okay, so this get name function allows us to get the name because this is a public function. Okay, and then we're going to end line, and we're going to also put an end line at the beginning. Okay, and let's do the same for we're going to do the same for the balance, and I'm going to put a $sign here, and I'm going to change this to get balance. Okay, so let's actually run this to make sure it works as expected. And I'm not commenting anything here, but I'll put a comment here. Let's say get account 1 info and display. Okay, so we're just gonna do that here. I expect you to do the comment a little bit more throughout your code, but just for demonstration purposes, I'm just gonna comment here. And so let's see if this runs as expected, right? So we're getting in from the user the account one name and balance, and then printing, creating the object account one using its overloaded constructor to pass in the values for the name and balance, and then we're printing it out here. Okay, so let's run this. So we're going to save and run. So you can see down here it's building the project. And one good practice actually is, you see how we have our account.h under the source files? It's better practice to actually move this up to your header files folder. So this is just good organization of your code to keep all the header files here and your source files, your CPP files here. Okay, so it's building, compiling, and there you go. So okay, so enter name for account one. I'm going to say my name, Jamal. My balance, maybe I have $1,000. And there you go. It prints out account one name, Jamal, account one balance, $1,000. Okay, so good. It worked as expected. So let's do the same for an account two. So for the account two, let's create the object a little differently, or set the values of the object a little bit differently. So let's say get account two info and display. So we're also going to still use the same code to actually get account two. So we're going to put this here. We're going to change this to 2. So I am copy and pasting. It's a quicker, but it's just try to follow along. We're going to overwrite the name and balance variables. So then we're going to create account two, but we're going to use the default constructor, right? One with no parameters. And then instead, we're going to use those mutator methods, the set methods. So we're going to say account two dot set balance. I'm sorry, let's do the name first, set name. And we're going to pass in the name that was entered here. Okay. And then we're also going to do the same for the balance, account two set balance, and the balance that was entered here. Okay, so great. So now we're actually going to be, setting the account one the way we did before, and now we're setting account two variables differently, right? We're now using the default constructor and using the mutator methods, right? Set name, set balance that we had created. Okay, and then let's print it out as we did before, and I'm going to do that down here. And you know what? I'm going to remove the end line here so we don't have as many line breaks. And I'm going to do the same thing here. Okay, and I'm going to change this to account two, and there we go. Okay, and also here, this probably isn't the best way to do it. You should, you can run into some errors and that might not be caught because this is actually printing out account one, which is valid, but that's not what we wanted. We want account two. So it's better to actually type this out again, but I'm just trying to do this quickly for demonstration purposes. So we have account two, we called get name and get balance, just as we did for account one. Okay, so now we have two different objects, and this is the whole idea of object-oriented programming. You have a single class, but you can declare multiple objects that have their own values, right? Each object's going to have its own values. You can call the same functions, but they're going to contain their own values, name and balance, for their appropriate objects, right? So account one is going to have its name and balance, and account two is going to have its name and balance. Okay, so the next step we want to do is let's run this. So we say run, yes. Okay, so again, it's going to build. Okay, so now we're going to enter the name. So I'll say Jamal, we'll say 1,000, and account two. So I should have left the space here, but that's okay. So we're going to enter the name for account two, say John, and the balance, maybe he has 50. And there you go. So account 2, name John 50. So it shows Jamal 1000, and then for account 2, John 50. So you can see we have these two different objects holding two different values for the name and balance. Okay, and press enter to continue. Okay, and then we also, let's go ahead and move this account.h to the header. So there's one other thing I should mention that we did not include that we should have included. So here we know how we had the constructors. There's also what's called a destructor. So a destructor is sort of the opposite. Destructor. Okay. So it's sort of the opposite in that the destructor, you specify what's actually happens when the object is no longer being used, right? Like say you're using the object in a function, and then locally within a function, and then the function is done executing. What happens when you're done with this object? You have to actually free, you might want to free space in memory, free those variables to allow you to have more space in memory. So what you can do is you can say, use similar to a constructor, except that you add this tilde. Okay, and we're not going to do anything inside. Sometimes you can, oh, I'm sorry, this is the header. So again, we want to leave it default. So that's it, right? We have a destructor. So there's no return type. There's no and there's no parameters. We're just, it's the same name as the class, but this tilde in front, right, preceding the name. So that's how you declare a destructor. So we can actually implement that here. And so we're going to implement the destructor defines destructor. And we're going to say account. And remember the tilde account. And there's not going to do anything, right? So sometimes you might want to delete a variable to free up memory or something like that. But we can leave this as default. And if you don't declare a destructor, it will do this by default, but it's good practice to actually implement it so we know it's there. And if we did want to do anything inside of here when the object is not being used anymore, we could. Okay, so let's go back to our main function and do one last thing. So we want to actually, let's test the withdrawal. So test withdrawal function. So we're going to say int withdrawal amount equals, let's say 100. Okay, so we're actually going to call the function. So we're going to say account 1 dot withdraw, and we're going to pass in the withdrawal amount and account 2 dot withdrawal amount. Okay, so now we're calling this function that we declared, and we're passing in the value withdrawal amount. Okay, so now we're going to actually print out the same information here. So I'm going to just copy this and copy this. Okay, so we're going to print out the same information and see how it's affected. Okay, so when we call this, we should see if it actually updates the balance. So we're going to run, save it, and we're going to run this. Yes. Okay, so now you have the same terminal, account 1. So we're going to say Jamal. Let's say I have 1,000. Let's say John. Hey, John only has $50 for initial balance. Okay, so let's see what happened. So notice that remember we called for account 1 we withdrew from Jamal's account, right? Account 1 first. It was successful, right? There was enough enough balance, right? Enough in the account. So for withdrawing $100. So it says success. Now remember the next thing we did was withdraw from John, right? So then it says insufficient funds because John only had $50 and the withdrawal amount was 100. Okay, so that's why. But notice how it updated it appropriately for Jamal's balance and John's balance. Okay, so it kept John's the same and subtracted 100 from Jamal's. Okay, so I hope all this makes sense and this will help you get started with Lab 1.